Managed mentoring for getting started in beekeeping. This is collapsing to two boxes. I am Kevin England. In this lesson, we'll review the rationale for collapsing down to two hive bodies and the factors that are in play for the environment in which the bees overwinter. We'll spend a short time discussing the biology of the bees and thermodynamics within the hive cavity and address a plan for removing off excess equipment as fall comes to a close. We'll end the lesson with a suggestion about optimizing colony arrangements for overwintering. It is fairly common wisdom that you should right-size the hive equipment to the size of a colony. Most normal colonies would be very suited to fit into two deep boxes for overwintering and nothing more. Of course, if you're running mediums, it would be 3 mediums. And as a rule of thumb, if your colony was small, you may even downsize it to a single box or a nucleus, depending on what you have going on. What we're going to talk about is generally a rule of thumb, but widely accepted in the industry. And different factors come into consideration for your arrangement. Are you going to insulate your boxes? Are you running quilt boxes? Things like that, that may change the equation a little bit, but still, we're very big fans of ensuring that you right-size the hive space of the interior to suit the colony. The commentary on the previous slide is to counter the fact that, yes, you will probably see people say that they overwinter with honey supers on, or they use a mountain camp feeder, if you know what that is. They run 3 deeps because they want to have the biggest colony going into winter. The fact is, bees are pretty resilient and they will make it through in those situations. But if you look at the thermodynamic studies that researchers have done over the years, there are some landmark ones that are out there. The evidence points to right-sizing the hive equipment to the size of the colony, and that is the way we would suggest you go when following this program. One thing to consider is the colony itself and all of the resources. You have the bees, you have 60 to 80 pounds of honey, you have some pollen, and of course you have what makes up the frames and the wax for the honeycomb and so on. A typical space to occupy all of that for overwintering is 2 deeps. The other thing to think about in that context is the bees do not keep the entire interior of the hive at temperature to maintain brood, as we'll discuss in a couple slides. But the residual heat coming off the bees and the warmth stored in the comb from interaction with the bees does get trapped a little bit, and the more you can optimize the space, the better off your bees will be. I'm fond of saying begin with the end in mind. This illustration is from one of the landmark studies I've referenced, and it gives you a sense of what the bees might look like when the temperatures go below 45 degrees Fahrenheit. The bees come together in a cluster, and in that cluster they generate heat to stay warm. The cluster occupies part of the space, and they give off heat to the comb and to the surrounding area. In this illustration, you could sense that the bees have already moved up in late winter to the top box, but they generally start down at the bottom and consume resources in the bottom box before they move up. This is what we're trying to prepare the environment for. If you could conceptualize what this looks like from a temperature standpoint, this is what the cluster might appear to be. Warm in the center where the queen has enough temperature to rear new bees, bees staying warm through the yellow zone, and the outer bees being shoulder to shoulder to contain as much heat as possible, and some of the residual heat coming off and surrounding the cluster. An important note, though, is the remainder of the inside of the chamber is generally only a couple degrees higher than whatever the ambient temperature is outside of the colony. This is a wider shot of the snapshot we just looked at, showing the hive interior. Now the bees are down in the bottom box, and you could tell from the purple surrounding air that the air immediately around the cluster is warmed, And in addition, some of that warmth is going to rise because heat rises up in and above the bees. The warmth coming off the colony may not warm the interior of the hive, but it does play a role in their ability to move left and move right to resources in the box within them. And in addition, the heat coming off the top of the cluster does warm some of the honey stored above them and help them to move up into the top of the hive equipment as winter progresses. I want to take a moment and discuss the operation of the colony in late summer and early fall all the way to first frost. The colony organization is how the bees want it. They may be in the top box, they may be in the bottom box, they may be in both boxes. Ideally, looking at the way that the design is shown here, where bees are all over the place, you would situate the bees down in the bottom box for winter and have a honey dome, frames of capped honey up and above them for them to move in. That would be the ideal situation, and a lot of beekeepers take strides, which we'll talk about later, to make that come to fruition. Optimally, this is what a good fall arrangement would look like. At the end of fall, there would be plenty of stores up and above the bees, and the cluster would give off heat where they could move up into the capped honey. The bees would be situated in the bottom box, and they could move left to right, and as winter progresses, come up in to the honey dome if they need additional resources to carry them through to spring. In an ideal situation, nature figures this out. You have a fall nectar flow where the bees bring in nectar that gets ripened to honey, and they tend to store that above the cluster of bees. If they are putting nectar and honey in the top frames, that's going to automatically make the queen go down below to build brood for end of summer, early fall, into late fall and overwintering. Self-organized by nature. However, as beekeepers, if you have a situation where that doesn't happen, you can intervene by feeding and cause the same situation to occur. In this slide, we can examine the thermodynamics that occur when you set up a colony in the manner that was discussed. Heat comes off of the cluster, it goes up to the top of the colony, and eventually it exits through the roof, through the sides of the woodenware, and even out the small hole in the notch if you have one of them. Heat will come up, it will collect at the top of the hive, and eventually bank down and cool off, carrying water vapors that could potentially transform into water drops. If you have the hive arranged in this manner, the heat again is going to come through and heat the honeycomb above, which will soften it some so that the bees can eat. And it's just the optimal way for heat transmission during the winter. If you think about the lesson so far, this is actually the money slide. There's a penchant for beekeepers to want to be helpful, and they feel like if they leave extra food on top, that would be better for the bees. It may or may not be, but the fact of the matter is 60 to 80 pounds can be well stored in 2 boxes, and the additional honey never ever gets touched. In the case of thermodynamics, though, heat rises up into that area, and it's too far away for the cluster for the bees to take advantage of it. It's actually a negative benefit to the bees to have extra space because it's not very helpful to the cluster when they don't have a lot of bees to give off heat when all the heat is up and away from them. So the takeaway point is honey super over brood nest is redundant. They don't need that honey, they're not going to use it, and it's actually a negative impact to the bees having that space above, and we recommend that you pull all your honey supers and collapse the hive equipment down to the size of the cluster as it overwinters. In this slide, I might be guilty of overemphasizing the point, but there's 2 key little critical aspects that I want you to understand, and that is when the hive is compact, that excess heat does 2 things. It's not heating the interior of the hive, but it does raise the temperature a few degrees. That is less work that the bees have to do. And in addition, the heat coming off the cluster, whether it's early, mid, or late, in the season is being absorbed by the honeycomb, and heat moves from one place to another throughout the season. The more it can be conserved inside, the less work the bees have to do, the less stress it is on the bees to make it all the way to April, if that's their fate. To pile on top of the notion, a top cover, meaning insulated top cover, is very, very much recommended. We suggest that you cut a 2-inch piece of foam the same shape as your inner cover and place it over your inner cover and under your telescoping cover. In the illustration previous, when we showed the arrows of the heat exiting the hive, the majority of the heat comes out of the top of the hive. And with an insulated cover, a lot of the heat coming off the bees can be maintained within the colony, which again is very beneficial to the amount of work they have to do from the time cold sets in till the time that it warms up in spring. When you receive instructions to take your honey supers off, you end up with maybe a problem. What do you do with what's inside the honey supers? Usually 3 different options are available to you. 1, you could just extract it if it's ready to go. 2, if it's dry, but it's not fully dry to the point of extraction, depending on what it is, you could extract it and then put it in a bucket in a dry room, dehumidify it down to the point where it reaches a moisture level that you can then bottle it. The third option is you could, depending on the time of the season, mix it with water and feed it back to the bees in a 2-to-1 solution and have them pack it in. There is one other management practice that bears mentioning. If you have honey supers over top, in this case you see there's 2 over top of 2 deeps on the left or 2 over 3 mediums on the right, you can employ a technique where you separate them from the brood nest, and on cool nights, if there's a lot of nectar in there, the bees may draw it down and bring it down into the brood nest. This is one of those management practices where your mileage may vary. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. This is a more intricate elaboration of that process, and maybe will draw a little better success. It does require some extra equipment, and let me describe to you how this works. The premise here is you're going to take your 2 unripened nectar boxes and move it further away from the nest of the bees. How you do that is take a spare inner cover and put it over the brood boxes, and then take an empty medium filled with frames that have nothing but foundation and place it over top. Put your 2 unripened boxes, or 1 if that's what you have, underneath the roof. And in the nights where it's cool, the bees would see the separation and not want to have resources up and away from the colony, and this would further elaborate their desire to pull that unripened nectar down into the brood nest and empty those boxes for you by the time winter comes. In a previous slide, we talked about if nature does its job, bees would pack on honey at the end of the season, and that would naturally move the bees down into the bottom box. As a beekeeper, you could purposely rearrange your equipment. Go through your box in a late summer, early fall, and move all of the brood frames down into the bottom and commence feeding 2-to-1 syrup. If you feed 2-to-1 syrup during the time that the bees have some form of nectar flow and pollen coming in, they will pack on that honey up over the brood nest. Just like rearranging in the spring to entice the bees, this is an alternative to that for the fall, where you can pack all the bees down in the bottom box, and it should make for the arrangements of capped honey up in the top. To finish the description of what you would do, you would go through and find all the brood frames, place them down in the middle of the bottom box. Next to it, you would place full frames of pollen to their left and to the right. If you have drawn frames of honeycomb, you would put those in frames 1 or 2, 8, 9, 10, meaning to the outside of the brood nest. After you've done that arrangement, if you have any additional drawn honeycomb, you would put it right above the brood nest in the top box, filling it out from the center as you go. If you have all drawn honeycomb, then you would just arrange it as the illustration shows. This lesson went through the guidance of overwintering your hives in compact setups and the rationale behind that. Next, we will talk about storing and protecting your drawn comb, if you have any, in reserve during the winter, dealing with wax moth, and winterizing your hives. If you have questions, you can ask at our next online session. You can also send an email to the address on the slide. If you're watching from YouTube, you can leave a comment below. If you're on our website, hover over the video with your mouse and click on the YouTube link to go to YouTube directly. And while you're there, subscribe to our videos. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you at the next lesson.